So when I think about the fourth industrial revolution, this picture speaks to me. This is a beggar in Shanghai. I think one aspect that speaks to me is that when I think about revolutions, and especially the fourth industrial revolution, which will proceed at a very rapid pace, there's going to be a lot of dislocation. A lot of dislocation. I think it's inevitable, especially as we talk about innovation that happens at a rapid pace. The other reason this picture speaks to me is that this beggar in Shanghai is, what's he holding out? A QR code. He's holding out a QR code because in China, the rapid rise towards mobile payments has made cash relatively obsolete. So if you are a beggar in Shanghai or Guangzhou or Beijing, you have to have a smartphone, and you have to have people give you handouts via that QR code because they have no cash. They have no cash. And as these numbers show, this happened really, really fast. So we think about industrial revolutions as happening over centuries or decades, and the kind of stuff we're looking at now is happening really, really fast with very high penetration rates of just a few years going from a small percentage to a very large percentage. And in China, it's happening at a massive rate. The mobile payments in China each year is actually greater than the GDP of China because those cash transfers are happening at multiple stages in the value chain. So when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, and by the way, you can have a copy of these slides afterwards. When you think about the Industrial Revolution, the fourth Industrial Revolution, we think about dissemination and growth of something like mobile payments as what would happen in the white. Customer experience drives payments, and more sellers sign on, and you have this gradual dissemination and growth of this new product. But what happens in China is all those ingredients that we think about, that John talked about, that Mary talked about early on, persist. There's massive pervasive networks. Everybody already has smartphones and edge devices. The data, as people use this application, as they buy and sell things, can be used to encourage faster and faster growth. So you have network effects, data. All of this stuff lies outside of how we used to think about scaling products because of this ecosystem, this environment that we live in. So the other thing that happens in this world is that, as Mary talked about, there's massive consolidation. Just two companies and two platforms literally own the mobile payment market in China. And it's very hard to imagine now, and they grew that in just a few years, it's very hard to imagine now that anyone is going to dislodge them, or at least easily, right? So a rapid pace of scaling in a very short amount of time, built on top of a set of platforms and ecosystems, right, that are larger than any one offering. That's what we're facing. And of course, this has happened in such a pace that over the last 10 years, if we think about those companies that are the exemplars, the exemplars of this fourth industrial revolution, we think about companies like these, Alibaba, Amazon, Apple, Baidu, and others, mostly in the US and China, some of which didn't exist 10 years ago, and which have had massive value creation. These are companies that are not only worth trillions of dollars, they have tens of millions of employees, they have billions of customers, in addition to the trillions in value. It's not emerging stuff, it's very real stuff. So as we think about transformation, I think, though, we have to recognize that this is a really hard business we're about. We are all faced with the possibility the question, how do we deal with this as an opportunity? But we're also dealing with the question of how do we deal with the challenge that this poses, right? As companies like that take advantage of these opportunities that are in front of them as well. So this is the question that I want to address a little bit today, and as Mary said, this is a question I've addressed my entire career. So what are the principles around digital strategy? And then how do you take these techniques and ideas and use them to become more innovative, more agile, even though we know that a lot of companies fall on the wayside, right? So some companies take this and go from good to great, and some companies take this and go from good to gone. And how do you sort of be in the right direction in that? So what I want to do is just draw from that work and give you 5 very high-level lessons to think about. You know, how do you think about the transformation to this set of capabilities, right? And I'll hopefully leave some time for questions at the end. So let me just jump right into it. First lesson. You have to embrace the gap. And this is the gap I'm talking about. Right? The natural tendency for organizations is to change incrementally. Right? We are designed, we're optimized, our products are optimized, our customers are optimized, our supply chains are optimized, our compensations are optimized around today's success. Today's business models, today's revenue streams, all of that. Right? And it's just human nature. And short term, the right thing to do to stay on that incremental line. But as we all know, technology is changing exponentially. In other words, the capability, the raw capability in which to build products is growing exponentially. And we know that markets abhor vacuums. Someone will take advantage of that raw capability and create new products, right, that perform better than the old products, or new products to create new markets that didn't exist, capabilities to solve problems that you couldn't solve before. And that wide opening is the opening for killer apps. What I think about is sort of revolutionary products that dominate, that either displace existing products to create new categories. It's as simple as that. It's the market at work. So when I think about mobile payments, you know, you could be in the credit card and the debit card business and say, hey, I'm about expansion. I'm about growing in the US, and maybe I'll move into China, right? And they leapfrogged that because the technology created that capability to create these mobile payments that didn't need credit cards or debit cards, right? So you could stay on that incremental line, or somehow you can deal with the gap that's created on the exponential. And we know there's a long history in these last 10, 15 years of great brands, great companies that stayed on that incremental line and were replaced by other companies that took advantage of the exponential. Some of those are large companies, some of those are startups. All right? But we know that bad strategies can happen to smart people and good companies, especially if they focus on that incremental line. And for me, the textbook example is Kodak. All right. I want to show you a short video clip that lets them tell their story in a couple minutes, then I want to come back and reflect on it.
For more than a century, the Eastman Kodak Company has been part of our lives, our memories, and our futures, continually pioneering technologies that make the process of taking pictures easier and the results remarkably better, allowing us all to share the precious moments we treasure, the benchmarks of our lives, with those we love. In fact, many of us fondly refer to those special times as Kodak moments. Kids growing up, puppies playing in boxes, elderly people blowing out birthday candles, daddy's little girl becoming a blushing bride. Gets you misty, doesn't it? Yep, they shovel the schmaltz on pretty thick. But that kind of crap doesn't work anymore. People want the latest digital things, more power, more features, wireless contraptions, innovative ways to bring their pictures into the 21st century. Well, guess what, bucko? Kodak is doing it. You thought they were just hiding out, waiting for this digital thing to blow over, didn't you? Oh, sure, for a while they were like, oh, there's no way digital's gonna catch on. Hell, 20 years ago, they pawned the first digital camera off on Apple, who marketed it with all the grace of an anaconda devouring a live chicken. If only it had come in more colors But now, Kodak is back. They're taking this digital thing to a level undreamed of, pioneering technology that'll redefine the digital revolution. I know, big talk coming from the company that unleashed Advantix onto the world, right? Well, turn down your mini disc player, fire up your Newtons, and listen up, because they're not playing grab ass anymore. They've got things in their research labs that'll make biometrics look like a Happy Meal toy. I'm talking facial recognition, GPS-enabled photography so my camera knows where it is, pictures that learn and group themselves into stories. We're talking meta-knowledge. Cameras that automatically enhance the color of the grass because they know it's grass. Try and patent that. Oh, too late.
So, what's going on here? One of the things I want to impress upon you that it's not a matter of technology, or at least it's not a matter of knowing about technology. You probably know this already, but Kodak actually invented the sensor at the heart of the digital camera. This is the man who did it, 1975, Steve Sassoon. That narrator is right. It was in the labs. They knew it. They had it. They had the stuff. They had the stuff. This is what Steve Sassoon said that management told him after that invention. But it's filmless photography. That's cute, but don't tell anybody about it, right? Why not tell anybody about it? Well, if you're on that incremental line and you're making 60 to 80% margins on a business where you essentially have 80 to 90% global market share, what do? You protect the hell out of it. And someone says to you, you know, we could be in the camera business, and the camera business has 20 to 30% margins. You say, why the heck would we want to do that? And someone says to you, maybe Josh's uncle came and said, these are the things we need to innovate. I need you to invest this. If you were the management, what would you do? You would invest in film, chemical, and paper. You would do it quarter by quarter by quarter by quarter as that exponential line grew. And you know what? Here's the funny thing. They knew that exponential line was going to grow. They did deep, sophisticated market research to say, at what point will digital threaten film, chemical, and paper? Well, they said, well, it'll happen when we reach a certain sensor density. It'll happen when we have certain interoperability between devices. It'll happen when print quality is at this level. They had markers for 15 years, and every time they hit one of those markers, they continue to invest in that incremental line. So all the way to almost the year 2000, how many of you had an Advantage camera? This is the thing that the narrator said, oh, I know, this is the company that unleashed Advantage on the world. They spent $500 million on this camera system. Well, actually, no, that's wrong. They wrote off $500 million on this camera system. And what this camera system did was, it had a digital sensor. You could see the shot. You could look at the shot you were doing. And it also solved some really hard customer sacrifices. And it didn't have sprockets anymore, so you could load the film without worry. You could preview the shots and actually mark how many prints you wanted. Because back then, we sent the film to the drugstore, and we got back the envelope with the negatives and all the shots, all the bad, prints of all the bad shots. So you could say, okay, just give me 3 of these and don't give me any of these. You know what you couldn't do? You couldn't save the image. You could only preview it. This was the best digital camera of its day, but the digital technology was focused on reinforcing that incremental line, film, chemical, and paper. And they wrote off $500 million with 2 years after the introduction. And by the time that video was made, it was actually made for an analyst meeting in 2007, where the CEO essentially said, we're not playing grab ass anymore. 2007. It also happened to be almost to the day 4 months before this, the introduction of the iPhone. So as one analyst said, by the time they got serious, the market had moved on. 2007, 2008, that was 33 years after they invented the camera. So it's not as if in 1975 they needed to bet big on digital. It's just that they didn't bet big on digital for 30 years, even though they had the patents. So in the end, as they went bankrupt in 2012, what was their asset? Digital, digital patents. So when we think about technology, and when we think about technology going up that curve, it's not digital cameras anymore, it's things like this. It's things like blockchain. It's what PwC calls the essential technologies. These are the technologies that aren't emerging, they're high up on that exponential curve. These are technologies that are creating gaps in capability. And all of our jobs is to understand what are the new products that are going to drive transformation, that are going to drive revolution, right, against what we're doing. So that's number one. Yes?
Yeah, Chunka.
So after you embrace the gap, what do you do? After you embrace the gap, what do you do? This lesson number two is really simple. You have to think big. You know, strategy is all about how large your consideration set is. You know, what possibilities are you willing to contemplate in order to assess what you do? And we tend to have a slight variance on either side of what we do. What we don't do is we don't open up that consideration set all the way. We don't say, okay, what do I do if I start from a clean sheet of paper? No legacy, no constraints. If I just said, these are the problems I want to solve, how would I solve them? Or all the way down to, hey, how do I play defense? What might somebody else do with the same capabilities? Think really, really big, right? Because I think in all my study of success and failure, one of the biggest problems is self-censoring before you know what the answer is, right? To allow yourself not even to consider the possibility that there might be an alternative path. So thinking big. So I will use automotive as an example as well, because it is something that we're all familiar with as customers. It's also really big. I mean, just in the US, the automotive sector affects something like $3.5 trillion of flow through various companies. It's also an industry that, if you look at it from the outside, hasn't changed for a century. It's essentially the same companies beating on each other, right, for the last century. So in a way, if innovation and disruption can happen in auto, it can happen even in your industries. So here's the particular problem in automotive I want to look at. One of the sad consequences of these products that these great companies build and sell to us is that it kills a lot of people. It kills a lot of people. You know, just in the US each year, almost more than 37,000 people are killed in accidents, almost 2.5 million injuries, more than 2.5 million injuries, almost 2 million people go to emergency rooms, 6.4 million reported accidents involving 10 million vehicles, and those are just the reported ones. This is sort of like the epitome of customer sacrifice based upon the products that we deliver to them. And it has a really high economic cost as well. Traffic fatalities, it was bad, it seemed like it was going down, and started going back up again. So the problem is still there and perhaps getting worse. Economic costs, this is US National Highway Safety Administration analysis of 2010 data. $277 billion in direct economic costs. If you factor in quality of life suffering, almost $900 billion each year. What's it caused by? 2% of it is mechanical problems with the vehicle. 2% of it is environmental factors, weather. 94% of traffic accidents, vehicular accidents, are caused by human error. Human error. The poor interaction of our customers with our products. So one of the things you can think about is how do you take advantage of all these technologies to address this massive problem? Because worldwide, more than 1 million people die and more than 50 million people are injured. Well, there are a whole bunch of people thinking about taking advantage of the technologies we talked about earlier to build autonomous vehicles, as Edie talked about. Right? Reimagine the core product to solve this really, really tough problem. And interestingly, if you think about it in the context of these slopes, it's like that incremental line is how can you build better and better products to help drivers drive better? The exponential line, taking advantage of the exponential line, is how do you remove the weak link in the system? Or how can you jump off that line completely and say, hey, maybe we can do something with no drivers? It's a really hard problem. Technology is really powerful. And it happens to fit into another virtuous cycle, because at the same time we're talking about autonomous vehicles, which will be unfortunately too expensive for any of us to buy anytime in the foreseeable future. It fits into the economic model we talked about earlier of car sharing, right? Because if you can take out a lot of the driver costs in car sharing, you can afford perhaps more expensive vehicles, especially if those vehicles are utilized 60, 70, 80% of the time, as opposed to sitting. And they're all built on electric vehicles. So you have this virtuous cycle where electric vehicles help you build driverless cars. Driverless cars might be introduced in fleets through car sharing services that deals with some of the cost issues, and it makes each other better and faster. But you can not only just reimagine the core product, once you have that capability, you can start imagining new business models. So the reason Uber is really interested in driverless vehicles is not to sell you cars, it's to sell you mobility. Right? So if you're a car maker, you're in a business selling cars, this high fixed cost item sold through dealers, it might be interesting to start to think about, how can we sell miles instead of cars, sell mobility instead of cars? Because, it's the second most expensive investment that any of us make. And there's a bunch of them in our garages, right? How many of you have a car? How many of you have 2 cars? How many of you have 3 cars? How many of you have 4 cars? All right, I'm going to keep going. How many of you have 5 cars? All right. Yeah. There's always somebody. But some of those cars you have because you need them for a specific function, a small percentage of the time. Right? So I'm not saying we get rid of all personally owned cars, but when you have chauffeured limos on demand at less than at a variable cost, you might start taking advantage of mobility-based services. And if you look at just in the U.S., we drive 3.2 trillion miles. That's a lot of miles. Just take a sliver of that, 10%. And if you charge $1.50 a mile, sort of in the range of what people are estimating, that's a $500 billion a year business. So there is a business model that drives this essentially global race that we have for autonomous vehicles, all starting from thinking big about that core product. And the ripple effects are even larger, right? If you look in the US, just in the US, and you look at how money flows through the system, right? If you're an OEM and you sell $300 billion a year in parts, if you're a tier 1 supplier and you sell $300 billion a year in parts to OEMs, and we move to driverless vehicles, you're still going to be selling parts, but they may be fewer parts, they may be different parts. So that $300 billion doesn't necessarily go away, but it changes a lot. If you're an OEM and you're selling $500 billion or $500 billion a year in cars, well, you're still going to sell cars, but you might sell them as fleets. You might sell them to others. And if you're a car dealer, well, maybe people won't buy as many new cars through you. Maybe you'll have more used cars to sell because of that. But there's a ripple effect all the way down. Insurance, we spend $200 billion a year on personal liability insurance, mostly because there are lots of accidents. If accidents go down, you still need insurance, but we won't need as much. Maybe it would be product insurance, not personal insurance. So you can see how the ripple effects go through. If you sell energy, if they're electric vehicles, they'll use electricity, not oil. So it's a really interesting disruption. Some of this money goes away, some of it changes hands, some of it requires different value propositions. So I think if you're thinking big, right, and you want to be optimistic, this exponential curve allows every industry to start thinking about what are the really big problems you can solve. What are the really big problems you can solve, hopefully profitably, to make the world a better place. And we think about sort of the social aspects, the social good aspects of the fourth industrial revolution. I'm hoping that we can emphasize those. I personally work a lot in transportation because I think mobility there's a lot of social issues related to mobility, not just mobility to get to jobs. I mean, there's a high correlation between mobility and quality of life, access to mobility, quality of life in seniors, in disadvantaged folks, in the poor that Josh was talking about. If you get people access to mobility for healthcare, that's a good bet. Healthcare itself, I spent a lot of time working on how do we better deal with chronic disease? How do we use technology to prevent chronic disease, to keep people healthy, as opposed to wait until they're sick to treat them? But in every sector, I believe there are major opportunities for immense good. So, the third lesson, after you embrace the gap, yes, Ryan? And then this is lesson number 3. Thanks for the setup. But you don't want to fall in love with your big idea after you somehow proved it a little bit. Right? You have to look at that and you have to say, okay, I need to take a scientific approach to the development at every level. Right? And our friend Gordon Bell, Gordon used to be an exchange fellow as well. He was the inventor of the mini computer. He has a great line. A demo is worth 1,000 pages of a business plan. Because we can come up with all the business plans we want today, for example, on how data gathered by autonomous vehicles will create $1 trillion industry. But, we'd just be making up spreadsheets, which we're all very good to, John said, I think it was Art said, if you weren't a transactional leader, you wouldn't be in this room. I mean, if you weren't good at transactions. John said, if you weren't good at strategic questions, you wouldn't be in this room. If you weren't good at spreadsheets, you wouldn't be in this room either, right? Because doing the right kind of spreadsheet is really important. But when you're at these early stages, of disruptive innovation, demos, proving you can actually do it is the most critical thing. So when Sergey Brin and Larry Page said to Sebastian Throne, can you build a driverless car? They didn't say, okay, you have a capital budget of this and give me a business plan in this amount of time. They said to Sebastian, can you build a car that will drive 1,000 miles? If you build a car that can drive 1,000 miles, then we can talk about the next step. And I don't want any 1,000 miles, I want 1,000 interesting miles. You gotta be able to drive around Lake Tahoe. You gotta be able to cross all the Golden Gate bridges, you gotta drive down Mount Array. I want interesting miles. And after they went 1,000 miles, they said, okay, can you do 100,000 miles? 100,000 miles on the highways, don't tell anybody about it, right? And it wasn't until they drove 100,000 miles that they told anybody about it. They gave John Markoff in New York Times an exclusive story, and he just happened to catch them looking out the car window, right? 100,000 miles. And that's when they got serious, 100,000 miles. And that's when they started thinking about platforms and ecosystems and business plans. All the way to what reported a few years ago, they almost bought Tesla, right? As Nick can't tell you, they made the rounds of every OEM trying to do a deal. They invested deeply in LiDAR technology. They started thinking about, okay, how does this affect our map business? Everybody else started thinking about how does this affect the map business. They put in $250 million into Uber. Later they invested $1 billion in Lyft. All around, what could they do with this technology? All right, so you embraced the gap. You thought big. You started small. The most important thing is to learn fast. The most important thing is to learn fast, right? Because I think that it's all about cycle time. There's no way you get it right the first time. There's probably no way you get it right the second time. But how fast can you iterate? How many cycles of learning can you get through? And progressively develop your ideas along the way. Waymo, this is the Google's self-driving car program spun out, has had 7 iterations of cars. 7 iterations of cars in these last 10 years or so they've been working on it. All the way from the golf cart to the Jaguar, right? They drove 10 million miles on the road. 10 million miles autonomously on real roads in a bunch of different cities. 600 cars, 25 cities, 25,000 miles a day, just running, driving, looking for cases they can't handle. And they also, building on the digital twin kind of idea, they also have 25,000 virtual cars in simulation mode, going 10 million miles a day. So you can imagine they had a case on the road, and they take that case and they run every new iteration of software against that case to make sure the new software still runs. Or they take that case and the pedestrian that was driving down the road, they had the pedestrian walk a little faster. Can the car handle that? They had the car turn faster. Can the car handle that? So you start taking these real world cases and making them more complex and continue to simulate and simulate because you have to find those really hard cases that we as drivers may encounter once in a lifetime. Nick, please. We should invite him to exchange, Caroline. All right, 7 billion miles in simulation mode. Let me just quickly run through the last lesson, since you all have taken up all my question time during my presentation. All right, so 2019. All right, John, it's going to take me 2 minutes to show an extra video of what the Waymo car looks like today and what it does. Should I?
Absolutely not. Nobody's curious.
Is anybody curious? Let's have a show of hands. Should I take the extra 2 minutes? All right.
The 10 million mile milestone is about 10 lifetimes of driving. It's a huge amount of experience that we've gained across the country in all kinds of driving conditions. And it takes that kind of experience to learn all of these lessons to really make that possible. How does Waymo see the ball before anyone else? It's always looking. It's always looking in all directions. The lasers are what lets it spot a small moving object that's approaching towards the car and estimate its position and velocity very precisely. So this is a very interesting case where there's actually a couple with a dog. At the same time, a jogger is just passing by and the jogger swings around the dog out of the bike lane into the road. The car doesn't just understand where the agents are. It actually understands how they're going to interact in the near future and is able to make those predictions in the blink of an eye before you can really understand exactly what's going on. Red lights and green lights, they're really important, but people sometimes don't obey that. In a case like this, where the red light runner happened, the car is actually checking all around in all directions all at once. And so it can see when there's somebody coming who looks like, wait, they're not really slowing down for their red light. And at some point we decide, wait, they actually look like they're gonna run the red light. Let's stop and let them go through. And then after they've gone, on we go. In the early days, we used to joke, how many engineers does it take to drive a driverless car? Because there'd be a bunch of people watching the thing, and so every mile it drove, there were a whole pile of people attending it. Those first 10 million miles were about learning and growing and proving things out. The next 10 million, the next 100 million, the next billion miles are about the cars just driving themselves, driving safely, driving people where they need to go and really making it easy and safe for people to get around, and that's super exciting.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful stuff. And of course, they've just announced they're launching a service, and they've ordered tens of thousands of cars in the future. Industry valuations about the future, who trusts them anyway, right? Industry analysts, but this is what Jeffrey says about the potential value of Waymo. Everybody else in the industry is chasing to catch up. A really smart auto executive said to me a couple of years ago that nobody was paying attention to this stuff until Google thought that Google proved it might be possible. This is the first time that the smart auto executive was in the room when I put up the quote. So I'll let you talk to him about that. All right, so I'm gonna go through, I'm not gonna show you this video, it's a Super Bowl video. It's really nice if you wanna see it later, it's 30 seconds. Oh, should I? Yeah, no, I won't. Let's skip this one, Scott. All right, so you wanna see it?
Yes.
You wanna see it?
Hands-free driving. Cars that park themselves. An unmanned car driven by a search engine company. We've seen that movie. It ends with robots harvesting our bodies for energy. This is the all-new 2011 Dodge Charger, leader of the human resistance.
That personified the auto industry reaction when they came public. But since then we know, right? SoftBank and Toyota, $1 billion into Uber. Elon Musk, over 1 million cars next year. GM, a whole bunch of transactions around the space, all the way from spending $1 billion on a core technology to building out factories and taking billions of investment from others. Last year, GM had almost 500,000 miles in cruise. 500,000 miles is a lot of miles. Compare that to 10 million and 7 billion, right? So I think this is why I think the fastest learner wins in this environment. So number 5 gets to Edie's question, because I think, you know, if I think about what large organizations do in terms of disruptive technology, what they often do is they swing from complacency to panic. Complacency to panic. You wait too long, and then you have to bet it all on one idea because you don't have any choice. They don't get themselves into this situation, right? What John talks about is how can you deal with these situations in a state of patient urgency because you have the capabilities, and then because you've had the foresight to prepare for them. But just because you have a great product doesn't matter if the market's not ready. If the market's ready and you don't have a great product, then you don't matter, right? So how can you be ready to scale at the right time? James Dyson, right, 5,170 design iterations before the first manufactured product. Reed Hastings, he knew streaming video was the future. He spent 10 years building it, right? Oftentimes pulling back when the technology wasn't ready or when the market wasn't ready. Built a whole new business and transitioned to this other technology. That was disruptive innovation. He disrupted himself. Uber, right? There's some people that say what you have to do is you have to scale really, really fast because you have to capture the market, and then you worry about profits later. I think the jury is still out whether or not it will be the next Amazon or the next web van, but both are possibilities. So scaling, learning, means that you're in a position to ask the question at critical stages. Do I kill this thing? Do I pivot to a different model? Do I iterate? Do I scale? Do I blitz scale? That's the luxury you want to provide yourself with a systematic process of innovation, as opposed to swinging from complacency to panic. So, as Dwight Eisenhower said, plans are nothing. Planning is everything. So I'll leave you with these 5 questions as you think about mastering the 4th Industrial Revolution. Are you embracing the gap? Do you know what the gap is? Are you thinking big enough? Are you starting small? Are you set up? Are you structurally set up to learn fast? And are you ready? Are you prepared? Do you put yourself in a position to scale with patient urgency? Thank you.